For years, Ben Affleck avoided saying one thing out loud. Not because he didn't know the truth, but because facing it meant admitting a version of himself he didn't want to see. He was an Oscar winner, a global star, a husband, and a father of three, yet privately he was losing control. When he finally began to speak honestly, what emerged was not a story about betrayal or scandal, but about shame, addiction, and the slow collapse of a marriage he never wanted to end before the cracks showed. When Ben Affleck and Jennifer Garner first crossed paths, there was nothing cinematic about it. They met while working on the film Pearl Harbor, surrounded by the machinery of a large studio production where relationships often blurred into schedules and publicity obligations. At that time, neither of them was emotionally available. Affleck was already becoming a tabloid fixture, and Garner was focused on building a steady television career. Their interaction was polite, professional, and forgettable, one of countless encounters actors have and never think about again. Everything changed when they reunited on Daredevil. The movie itself would later be remembered more for its disappointment than its success, but for Affleck it became quietly transformative. Years later, he admitted that the experience forced him to rethink how he measured failure. The film was criticized, mocked, and quickly moved past by the industry, yet it marked the beginning of the most emotionally grounded relationship of his life. He would later reflect that public failure and private meaning do not cancel each other out, a realization that would follow him long after the cameras stopped rolling. Their connection formed under complicated circumstances. Affleck was disentangling himself from the wreckage of a very public breakup that had turned his personal life into mass entertainment, while Garner was facing the end of her own marriage, a process that left her cautious and reserved. When they finally went public, there was no spectacle and no loud declarations. Instead, there was a noticeable calm around them. They appeared grounded, even guarded, as if both understood the cost of attention too well to invite more of it. That calm extended into their decision to marry. They chose a small, understated ceremony, avoiding the pageantry typical of Hollywood unions. For Affleck, this was not just a romantic choice, but a psychological one. He later described Garner not as someone who rescued him, but as someone who studied him. At a time when he felt increasingly dismissed as an artist, her belief in him mattered deeply. He credited her with helping him regain confidence and giving him the emotional security to pursue projects that required vulnerability and creative risk, projects that would later redefine how he was perceived in the industry. Yet even in those early, seemingly stable years, pressure was quietly building. Paparazzi attention intensified almost immediately after they became a family. Photographers waited outside their home, followed their cars, and crowded places where privacy should have been unquestioned. Garner later recalled moments of desperation, pleading with photographers to step aside while she carried a sick child into a medical office. These were not abstract complaints, but daily intrusions that chipped away at any sense of normality. Affleck grew increasingly angry at a system that treated his family as acceptable collateral. He spoke openly about the danger and emotional toll of that attention, insisting that his children never consented to fame. The constant surveillance created an environment where even minor stresses felt magnified. There was no space to argue privately, no room to struggle without judgment. Outwardly, they still looked steady. Two successful actors, 3 children, and a carefully maintained image of balance. But inwardly, something more fragile was forming. Not a dramatic rupture, but a slow accumulation of strain quietly settling beneath the surface, unnoticed by the world that would later claim to have seen it coming all along. When addiction entered the marriage, the pattern became harder to ignore. For a long time, Affleck believed he was different from the people he grew up watching. Alcoholism had shaped his childhood in quiet but lasting ways. He saw it in his father, his aunt, and his grandmother, and he promised himself that history would not repeat. When he first entered rehab early in his career, he framed it as a precaution rather than a diagnosis. He told himself he could stop whenever he wanted, that discipline and success would keep things under control. Marriage, fatherhood, and professional respectability gave that belief structure. When he and Garner built their family, Affleck appeared settled. He worked steadily, stayed out of major scandals, and presented himself as someone who had moved past earlier chaos. But addiction does not disappear simply because life improves, it waits. As the responsibilities of marriage grew heavier, So did the internal pressure he never learned how to release. Affleck later explained that drinking did not start as excess. It started as relief. Long days ended with a glass, then another, then a routine. He told himself it was normal, that everyone unwinds, that this was not who he really was. Over time, those justifications hardened into denial. He began drinking every night, often until he passed out on the couch. He was still showing up for work and still functioning, which made it easier to pretend there was no problem. But inside the marriage, the cost was becoming visible. Depression followed the drinking, and the drinking deepened the depression. Affleck admitted that the hardest part was not recognizing the addiction, it was recognizing what it was doing to his family. The realization that his children might grow up afraid of him, or afraid for him, was something he could not bear to accept. As the marriage began to strain, the cycle intensified. He drank more as things fell apart, and things fell apart faster because he was drinking. Looking back, Affleck described this period with painful clarity. The addiction did not simply coexist with the marriage's collapse. It actively accelerated it, quietly and relentlessly from the inside out. By the time deeper problems inside the marriage began to surface, Affleck and Garner were no longer just a couple trying to hold things together. They were a family living under constant observation. The attention was no longer occasional or manageable. It was daily, aggressive, and inescapable. Photographers waited outside their home, followed their cars, and crowded public spaces where their children were supposed to feel safe. Garner later described those years as relentless, recalling cars parked outside their house from early morning until night and being followed to school drop-offs and medical appointments. What might have been background noise for other celebrities became a permanent source of anxiety inside their home. There was no privacy to argue, no space to struggle quietly, and no room to heal without judgment. Affleck felt the pressure differently, but just as intensely. He said the intrusion crossed a line when it involved his children, emphasizing that they had never chosen this life. He described the experience as a mix of safety risk and mental exhaustion, a constant reminder that even the most personal moments could be turned into headlines. That pressure did not create the marriage's problems, but it magnified them, stripping away the ability to cope in private. As tensions grew, so did speculation. Tabloids framed every photograph as evidence of trouble. Any distance between the couple became a story, and any absence was interpreted as betrayal. Inside the marriage, that noise made communication harder. Trust eroded not only between spouses, but also between their reality and the version of their lives being sold to the public. In response, Garner took an unusual step. She chose to confront the system directly, testifying before lawmakers to support stronger protections for the children of public figures. It was a quiet but telling moment. While the marriage was under strain, her focus remained fixed on shielding her children from harm. For Affleck, it was another reminder of how much was at stake and how little control he felt he had left. The marriage was not breaking in isolation. It was breaking under lights that never turned off. In the months leading up to the separation, the relationship was already fragile, but one specific controversy pushed their private struggle fully into public judgment. Rumors began circulating that Affleck had grown close to the family's nanny, Christine Uzunian, a young woman hired to help care for their children. What might have remained gossip quickly escalated into a narrative that the media labeled as betrayal. Reports claimed that Uzunian had accompanied Affleck and the children on a family vacation while Garner was reportedly separated from her husband. When Garner later joined the trip, tabloids alleged that Affleck left early and traveled elsewhere with the nanny. Photographs soon appeared that were framed as confirmation of an inappropriate relationship. The timing was brutal. Just days later, Affleck and Garner announced their separation one day after their 10th wedding anniversary. Through his spokesperson, Affleck denied any romantic or sexual relationship. Sources close to him insisted that the relationship had been professional and platonic and that there had never been an affair. But the denial did little to slow the public narrative. Once the story took hold, it became the explanation people preferred. Years of quiet strain, addiction, depression, and exhaustion were reduced to a single scandal-ready headline. Garner's response revealed far more than any accusation. She later stated that the nanny had nothing to do with the decision to divorce. She acknowledged poor judgment, but refused to assign blame. More importantly, she framed the situation around her children. explaining that it was not healthy for them to suddenly lose a caregiver amid chaos and public speculation. In doing so, she shifted the focus away from anger and toward responsibility. For Affleck, this was the moment when control was fully lost. The marriage was ending. The press had chosen its villain, and his addiction, already worsening, was no longer something he could hide behind charm or explanation. Years later, he admitted that while the rumors were painful, the deeper truth was harder to face. The marriage had been collapsing long before the world noticed. It was not a sudden implosion, but the final crack in something that had been breaking quietly for years. After the separation became public, Affleck entered the most difficult phase of his reckoning, not with the media, but with himself. For a long time, he had blamed circumstances, pressure, paparazzi, timing, even bad luck. But once the marriage was truly over, those explanations stopped working. What remained was regret, layered and persistent, along with an addiction that no longer carried the illusion of control. Affleck later admitted that the divorce was the hardest thing he had ever had to be honest about. Not because he did not love Garner, but because accepting the end of the marriage meant accepting that he was not the person he believed himself to be. He said he never wanted to be divorced, never wanted to be part of a split family, and never imagined putting his children in a position he had sworn to avoid. That realization brought a level of shame he struggled to articulate. In interviews, he described how his drinking escalated as the marriage unraveled. What began as nightly drinking turned into drinking until he passed out night after night. Eventually, he reached the point where he could no longer argue with the truth. He was an alcoholic. The years that followed were unstable. Affleck entered rehab more than once, including relapses that forced him to confront how fragile recovery could be. Each setback brought public scrutiny, but the real damage was private. The fear that his children would grow up remembering him not as a father, but as a problem. Despite everything, Garner remained present, not as a spouse, but as a co-parent. She intervened when she believed his health was at risk, prioritizing their children over resentment. For Affleck, that support carried enormous weight. It reinforced the truth he would later state plainly. The marriage did not end because of one scandal or one mistake. It ended because his addiction, untreated and denied for too long, slowly made the relationship unsustainable. Years after the divorce was finalized, Affleck began speaking with more clarity and less defensiveness. He rejected the tabloid version of events and replaced it with something quieter and more uncomfortable. There was no single dramatic betrayal that destroyed the marriage. Instead, he and Garner grew apart under the weight of unresolved problems, especially his drinking and depression. He explained that marriages rarely end suddenly. They erode. Small disappointments accumulate, trust weakens, and resentment replaces patience. In his case, addiction amplified every flaw. It made communication harder, accountability easier to avoid, and intimacy increasingly fragile. By the time the separation was announced, the emotional distance had already become permanent. Affleck was especially critical of how the media framed the divorce, saying that false stories turned personal pain into spectacle. But he also made it clear that anger toward the press could not replace responsibility. He acknowledged his role fully, stating that his drinking created real marital problems and that no external pressure could excuse that. What ultimately emerged from his reflections was a consistent theme: love alone was not enough. He and Garner loved and respected each other, and still do. But love could not compensate for addiction that remained untreated for too long. In his words, the hardest lesson was understanding that good intentions do not undo damage already done. Today, Affleck speaks about the divorce not as a failure he obsesses over, but as a truth he accepts. His focus is no longer on regret, but on learning, on staying sober, and on being present during the formative years of his children's lives so they never have to be afraid of him or for him. Do you believe some marriages end because of one mistake, or because of many small truths ignored for too long? Let us know what you think. And if this story resonated with you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below.